Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Robin Bennett, and I am the Director of Programming here at the Shaar. And it is a pleasure to welcome you here, those who are in person and those who are joining us online. It's wonderful to have an in-person audience. It's been about 2.5 years since we've been able to gather in this fashion, and it feels good. It feels really great to be here. So before we begin, I just want to remind everyone we have our third session for Tuesday Night Learning coming up next week. Next Tuesday at 7:30. We'll be online for that, when our guests will be Shan Julie Wang, who will be speaking about her memoir, Beautiful Country, and she'll be in conversation with Rabbi Rachel. And then in 2 weeks, we'll be live and in person as well with Dara Horn, who will be in conversation with Rabbi Adam Shaar on her book, People Love Dead Jews. So we hope you'll join us for that. Following this evening's program, you can purchase books and have them signed by our guest this evening, and you can otherwise buy them at Bibliophile or wherever you buy your books, for those of you who are joining us online. So and now I would like to introduce Cantor Gideon Zelermyer, who will introduce our special guests. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy.
Thank you, Robin. Good evening, everyone. It's great to see so many of you here in person and to wave to so many of you online. It is a real pleasure this evening for me to host a connection that is both new and old. Rebecca Frankel is with us this evening. She is a longtime editor and journalist, was formerly executive director of Foreign Policy print magazine and managing editor of Moment magazine. She's been a guest on Conan, PBS NewsHour, BBC World News, among other places. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, the Washington Post. Rebecca is the author of New York Times best-selling book War Dogs, Tales of Canine Heroism, History, and Love. And we're here to discuss this evening Into the Forest, a Holocaust story of survival, triumph, and love, which was named one of the 10 best history books of 2021 by Smithsonian Magazine and a 2021 National Jewish Book Award finalist. Rebecca, welcome to Montreal.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, everyone. It's so nice to have these live in-person events and to be doing this with Gideon. It's wonderful.
I wish we could have gotten you a little bit better weather today to walk around the city. But...
I had a good nap, a good Montreal nap, so it was wonderful.
And you had a good dinner.
I had a wonderful dinner. I had an amazing dinner.
So what was not advertised about this evening is that Rebecca and I share roots. Mm-hmm. We both grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut. Well, actually, yes.
Yes, both of us did.
We both grew up in West Hartford, Connecticut, but we were affiliated with different synagogues.
We were. There were many synagogues in West Hartford, Connecticut, so.
Yes, but it's a beautiful story because the two synagogues that we were respectively affiliated with merged.
They did.
Beth Hillel congregation in Bloomfield, and my father was the rabbi at Emmanuel Synagogue in West Hartford for 19 years. And before we get to the whole synagogue connection,
right.
I would think that our most precious shared experience is the fact that we're both graduates of Hall High School.
Yes. It was a very special place to have your formative educational experience. And we've been talking about our favorite teachers, which we shared. I recently had the opportunity to go back to my high school and talk to them about this book and being a writer. And all of the teachers that we had have since retired, so it's been a long time. But we got to talking about, our very special experiences. And
it really was a unique place. It was a public high school, but one that was renowned for excellence, both in its academics, which is clearly your side of the aisle, and its music, which was clearly my side of the aisle.
Absolutely, that's true.
I also had the experience of going back to sing when Lori Chetto, our longtime choir director, retired, and she asked me to come back and sing at her concert. And I think it's a fairly common thing. People who had that experience at Hall feel a strong pull. You were actually a classmate of my brother's.
Yes.
And I think you share the same beloved teachers.
I do. And so in going back to these students and talking to them about, my career and everything I've done since I graduated, basically, I had the opportunity to sort of think about what it was like to go to school there and what did I want to say to them. Because if you've ever sat in front of a group of very disengaged teenagers, you don't want to repeat the experience. So I wanted to find something special to say. And I really do feel like the teachers that I had then, Mrs. Ludlow, Mrs. Pandolf, Mrs. Kennedy, Dr. De Palma, I mean, many more, those were the teachers that made me feel like I could be a writer. And so here I am talking to them about writing in this place where I had this first, understanding, and people who thought and said to me, like, yes, you can go do this. And I know that you had the same thing for your career and what you wanted to do with your life.
It's a very, very special place, and it really impacted both of us in our formative years in ways that are, I think we find new ways in which it impacted us as we go along in life.
Yes, absolutely. And I was able to see one of my former English teachers, Mrs. Pandolf, and, you think in growing up that in your mind that they know what you think of them and that they have people who share their experiences with them all the time. And they don't. And so it was really special to feel like I was able to sort of reciprocate some of the appreciation that I had for everything that she did.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Totally agree. So, how did you get into writing? What was your first gig?
My first gig. Well, I went to American University in Washington, D.C., and while I was there, I was sort of an intern, like a personal assistant and a researcher for a writer who lived there, and she was a wonderful boss. And then I went to work at Moment magazine, which was founded by Elie Wiesel in the 70s. And by the time I worked for Moment, it's a Jewish magazine, culture, politics. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. It was under new management and associated with a new nonprofit organization. But it was, a place where I got to work with really wonderful writers, really wonderful stories. One of the stories I edited, I think the writer has just come out with a book this year, but he knew Bob Dylan and Marlon Brando, and we worked on this essay about how they sort of crashed the Passover Seder at his synagogue, and it was just such an amazing story. So that was a wonderful place to work. And then I went to Foreign Policy magazine, which is a very different kind of work. International breaking news, long investigative features. And really the things that are similar about them and the two books that I've written are that, for me, and I did say this to the All High kids, what was important is to tell stories about things that matter and to do it through the lens of human experience. So this book certainly does that.
So let's talk about War Dogs for a second.
Oh, sure.
Tell me about War Dogs. How did that whole story come up?
So when I was working at Foreign Policy magazine, I came in with like editor cred, but not necessarily like foreign policy cred. And what I mean is that I wasn't like a really big wonk. I didn't know a ton about it. I knew how to edit and I knew how to work with reporters and writers and photographers, but there was a steep learning curve. And one of the writers I worked with was named Tom Ricks. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He covered the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. And I was his editor. And what I realized is that we had one thing in common, which was that we both loved dogs. And so right around the time when things in Afghanistan were really getting bad again, like in the late early 2000s, I came across a group of photographs that showed Marine Corps dog handlers and their bomb-sniffing dogs. And I didn't really know the history that this country, the United States, has, that many other countries have with bomb-sniffing dogs or bringing dogs to war. And so I said, Tom, you should write about this. And he said, well, why don't you write about it? And I said, okay, I'll do that. And then I did. I wrote a weekly column for him called Rebecca's War Dog of the Week, which is my favorite title, hands down, forever. And it was very popular, which was wonderful. And then during the Osama bin Laden mission, in the news reports that came out afterwards, there was a line about how there had been a dog with the SEALs team that went in. And so I wrote an article, and it broke our website. It did very, very well. It had some really wonderful photographs that I was able to pull together. And so I had the wonderful experience of someone coming to me and saying, would you like to write a book about this? And so I spent, a few years going around to different military bases, sort of getting really in the weeds of the experience of what it means to train dogs to sniff bombs, and went all over the United States and went to different military installations and different military bases, and just, got to watch them do their thing, which was special. And so that culminated, it ended up being the War Dogs book.
And you actually adopted one, did you not?
I did. During one of my trips, I was in Yuma, Arizona, which housed a pre-deployment training course, which is a really special thing because it's really essential to their training before they go down to combat theater. And at the time, that was Iraq and Afghanistan. And I got to know this one handler, an Air Force handler named Justin Kitts. And as I was interviewing these handlers and about their experiences going downrange and being in a combat situation with these dogs, these are really heavy and sometimes deeply personal conversations, because oftentimes, the job of a bomb sniffing dog team is to make it safe for everybody else to go walk the roads they're walking, to go into the buildings they're going into. It's a very dangerous job. And so he told me a very special story about the experience he'd had with his bomb sniffing dog, Dingo. And then I got to meet Dingo a couple of times after that. And when it came time for Dingo to retire, as these bomb dogs eventually do, the handlers who were in line to adopt him couldn't take him for various reasons. And so they reached out to me and said, "We know you love him. Would you want to take him?" And I said, "I don't know." And then I thought about it, and it took some time, and I did eventually adopt him, and I had him for 4 years, which was difficult in the beginning because military dogs, like our servicemen and women, have a job and a purpose, and when they retire, that job and that purpose goes away. And it was hard for him to move into a house and just be a regular dog. He got the hang of it eventually, so that was good. But yeah, that was a pretty amazing experience. I miss him.
An experience of telling a story that mattered.
Yes, his story really mattered as a dog, and for all the people that he served with. If you have dogs at home, then you probably understand what this bond is, and then you have to imagine in a life and death situation that connection is amplified, and especially that feeling of love and just how much they care about these animals is really incredible, and it makes them better at their job. I really do believe that. Yeah, that was that book.
Story.
Yeah.
So let's move to the beautiful story that we actually came here to discuss, which is a story that if you grew up in the West Hartford Jewish community, this was a story that you knew, but really from one perspective. Yes.
So I grew up, let's see, so we talked about this. I'm just going to flip through some of these photos as we're talking. So I grew up going to Beth Hillel Synagogue in Bloomfield, Connecticut, where this man on the right, Rabbi Philip Lazowski, was my rabbi. And this woman on the left, Ruth Lazowski, was his wife.
Still is his wife.
Still is his wife, excuse me, yes. They just had their 66th wedding anniversary. They are beloved. They're like celebrities. That's how much people care about them. And he wears many hats in addition to being a rabbi. He's the chaplain of the Senate and of Hartford Hospital and the police force. And so if you know anything about Rabbi Lazowski and Ruth, and if you went to Hebrew school like I did growing up, then you probably had Ruth as your 4th grade Hebrew school teacher. And you knew that both Ruth and Rabbi survived the Holocaust. And even though it wasn't in the same part of the woods, they both survived by living in the forest, by escaping the same ghetto. They were interned in the same ghetto in what was then Poland, a town called Szedal. And so you knew that story. And the story, you can't really tell one story without telling the other, but the one that is sort of famous, that we both knew growing up, is that this woman here on the left, that's Miriam Rabinowitz, Ruth's mother, and that's a young Philip Lazowski. And so you know the story of how they first met in Szedal, and this was during a selection in April of 1942. And basically a selection was they took all of the Jews who were in the ghetto, they rounded them up, they pushed them outside of the ghetto. I'm talking about the Nazis and the SS officers, and I think there was some Lithuanian and Poles who were helping. They pushed them out of their houses. They forced them out into a field, and basically they were going through. They made everybody line up, and at the front of the line was an SS officer. In this case, the man's name was Wilhelm Traub. And as people would come up, they would show their identity, their papers, and they would also show work certificates if they had them. And this SS officer would look at their papers, look at them, and he would either direct them to the left or direct them to the right. And the people who were going to the left were able-bodied people, strong men and women, and also people who had working certificates. And to the right were elderly people, people who were disabled in some way, and children who were there without parents. And so on this morning, young Philip Lazowski ended up in this field by himself. He had been separated from his parents. And he quickly understood that being a child on his own was very dangerous, and he was not going to make it through this selection by himself. And even though he wasn't from the town of Shtetl, there were other Jewish families and people he knew from his own town who had all been sort of pulled together into this regional ghetto in Shtetl. And he went up to them and he asked them for help. And of course, you have to imagine that this was a very dangerous thing to do. This boy would not be listed on their papers. And so people were saying no and pushing him away. And so he's looking around, and he sees a woman, and she has a kind face. And with her, she has 2 young children. And he approaches her and he says, "Please, will you pretend that I'm your son?" And without hesitating, she looks at him and she says, "If the Nazis let me live with 2 children, they'll let me live with 3. And she takes his hand. And that woman was Miriam Rabinowitz. And so Ruth, or Rochel as she was called back then, Rochel Rabinowitz and Philip Lazowski had their first encounter. And they go through the line, it becomes their turn, the SS officer calls them up, and he looks at her papers, and now her husband Morris had already gotten through already, and he's shouting to the SS officer in German, "That's my wife," and she's shouting back, "That's my husband." And the SS officer looks at all of them and he points to the left. So Miriam Rabinowitz, her 2 daughters, Rochel and Tanya, or Ruth and Toby as I call them now, and this young boy that they didn't know make it through the line. And so...
And this is the story that we heard growing up.
Yes.
And that's a mind-blowing enough story for kids sitting in grade 4 Hebrew school to process.
Right.
It stuck with you, obviously.
It did. And so it continued, of course, because eventually the families reconnect, and that doesn't happen until 1953 in the United States. And Philip Lazowski attends the wedding, and as he's talking to this young woman who's sitting at the same table, they find out that they have stuff in common, and they both survived the Holocaust. They were both from small towns in Poland, and he tells this girl that he's from the town of Belitsa, and she says, "Oh, I know a woman who once saved a boy from Belitsa." And he says, "Well, what was the story?" And she tells him this story. She tells him the story of the woman who helped a boy get through a selection line. And he says, "That was me. I'm that boy." And he runs to the payphone. He makes a call. He calls the operator. He knows the name. It's Rabinowitz. He calls for Hartford, listings for Rabinowitz, and the operator says, "Well, there are a lot of Rabinowitzes in Hartford," and he didn't have enough money to, this is a great story. He didn't have enough money to pay for more than one call, and he says, "Well, dial the first one." And she does, and Miriam Rabinowitz answers the phone. And that night he goes home and he writes a letter to Miriam Rabinowitz, and he sort of pours his heart out. And Miriam Rabinowitz kept that letter. The Holocaust Museum has it now. And so he goes and visits the family in Hartford, Connecticut. And while he's there, he meets really for the first time her now teenaged daughters, grown up. And he, sees Ruth and finds her very attractive, or decides that he likes her. And so they start this very long courtship that begins with letters. And eventually, so this is when they're dating. On the right is when they get engaged. And these are their wedding photos. So this Holocaust story, the one that we knew about Ruth Lazowski and Rabbi Philip Lazowski, is remarkable in many ways, but probably one of the most compelling one is that it's, a Holocaust story with an uplifting tale. It has many things that Holocaust stories tend to have, especially when we're talking about survivors, chance and fate and things that sound like destiny. But there's a happy ending, and it just, it really continued. So this is their family on the left, and that's I don't actually know where they are, but they're happy, right? You can see how happy they are. So
They are. I being part of the rabbinic community in West Hartford, we socialized with the Lazowskis a lot growing up.
Yeah.
Their boys are older than my brother and I, but I knew them, and I actually had the experience. I don't know if I told you this.
I don't know.
Rabbi Lazowski retired from Beth Hillel
Okay.
in 1999. I was the cantor for his last high holidays.
That's right. My parents told me about this.
I was the cantor for his last high holidays. Now, Rabbi Lazowski had an interesting sense of humor. If you remember, he
does. He still does.
He's very dry, but he also is very serious. So it's a total aside, but it's a great story. How the first day of Rosh Hashanah, he gets up and he tells everyone that this is his last Rosh Hashanah, and if they show him that they like his sermon, maybe he's prepared with an encore. And everybody laughed.
Yes.
And he gave his sermon. And at the end of the sermon, he finished. And I think his boys started to clap. And then everybody else started to clap. And everybody stood. I mean, they've been the rabbi there for 40-something years.
Yes.
Everybody stood. And so he nodded and reached under his lectern and pulled out another folder with another sermon. And proceeded to give another sermon.
It was his last hurrah.
It was, but the love that community had for these two
really
people, it was so palpable. And I mean, just the way that you call him, it's rabbi. It's not the rabbi. It's not Rabbi Lazowski. It's rabbi. It's like you'd say Zaidi or.
So during this whole process of interviewing Ruth and her younger sister Toby, who I hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about a little bit, the Rabinowitz daughters, I have had to call him Philip, and it is almost painful to not just call him Rabbi. But one of the stories I do like to tell, because it sort of illustrates just this, what we're sort of talking about this particular Jewish community is that, and I know it's different here, we were talking about it, but my parents, went out right after they got married, and my sister and I were young, and they wanted to find their Jewish community. Where would we go to Hebrew school? Where would we have our bat mitzvahs? And so they went to Beth Hillel Synagogue, and I know they knew Rabbi from something else, and my dad likes to tell the story of how while they were touring the synagogue, a group of kids just ran past them, like they couldn't wait to get to where they were going. And at the end of the hall, who was standing there was Rabbi Lazowski, and they wanted to get to him. And my dad said, "This is where we're gonna go." And I don't know if he knew this, but Rabbi used to carry candy around, so that accounted probably for some of it. But they make people feel like family. And certainly I should say that the whole of the Langerman, which is Toby's married name, and the Lazowski family is really, this was a long process. This book was a long time in the making, many, many hours of interviews and visits and trips during a pandemic, a lot of it. And they were very embracive of the experience and very open to me with their stories and their memories, and not all of it was happy, right? There is this beautiful story and there is this beautiful connection, but their experience in the forest and what they went through was awful, right? It really was.
You begin the book, the prologue begins with the depiction of this wedding. Tell us about that.
So I felt that, and this is a part resulted from the way I wrote my book proposal, because that's part of getting the opportunity to write a book, is you have to convince someone you're going to do a good job of it and that there's a good story to tell. And there were so many things about this family's story that are remarkable, and someone was saying to me earlier that if you didn't know it was true, it would be hard to believe, or certainly it gives you reason to believe in fate or destiny. That there were so many of these moments that, to start at the beginning of the story, which for me in chapter 1, that's with Morris and Miriam Rabinowitz, who are here, Ruth and Toby's parents, that it takes too long to get to the parts that, give you goosebumps or, make you gasp a little bit. And so I thought the wedding is the place to begin because it teases at the happy ending. So, for anyone who's not ready to sit down to a sad story, then at least they should know that it's worth the wait, right? It's worth getting to the end to find out what happened. So that's where the book begins.
The forest that they were in. Tell us about some of the experiences of this sort of hidden community.
So part of what's interesting about this particular chapter of the Holocaust narrative is that it's not, people don't know as much about it. It's not, when I was doing my research, I couldn't go and read articles about it, or if there were some, they were very few and far between, or I couldn't go and find just one collection of Holocaust testimony that's just about the woods or the forest. And there were 25,000 Jews who survived being in the woods of Eastern Europe. So if we think about how many people potentially went in, and many more, of course, did, then that is a significant number. And it's certainly not anything near as big as the numbers of people who were in concentration camps. But it is a part of what happened during this time and during the war and to these Jewish communities. So when the Nazis finally did come to the eastern part of Poland and these other countries that had been sort of divvied up between Germany and Russia when the war first began, for them, the only source of hope or, the only place that provided any real hope of surviving was the forest. And in the town of Szedel, and for this family, that's what they decided to do. That after they went through this first selection, they weren't if the Nazis called them or tried to get them to go somewhere, they were not going. And they started building a bunker in the house that they were in the ghetto. And their plan was always to escape to the woods. And I won't go into it. It is in the book. But the head of the Judenrat in this town, Szedel, was unique for many reasons. And he was planning sort of an uprising. And there was a plan for the Jews of Szedel to escape to the woods. And the family, was sort of in on it a little bit, but they managed to do it on their own when the ghetto was liquidated in August of 1942. And so, the forest was not a particularly hospitable place to hide, especially if you're thinking of these people and these families who left in the summer, escaped in the summer. They left without shoes. They certainly didn't have winter coats or hats or anything like that. And they just ran to the forest, and if they made it, then they sort of sorted things from there. And so once, they were able to get there, many of them broke into family groups. Some of them joined the Soviet partisan fighters. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard or have read about the Bielski brothers. We were just talking recently about the film Defiance. It was made in 2008. Which depicts this life. But this particular family, Morris Rabinowitz, who's right down here in the front sitting, he had been a lumber dealer in Szedel and had been a very popular man and had had relationships with Christian farmers who lived on the outskirts of town. And in particular, he was friends with a forester. So not only did he know his way around the woods, but he had friendships and people those friendships held, which was a difficult thing to do during this time. There were lots of reasons. Very risky, especially for these, not just for the Jews, of course, but for these Christian families. Yes. Yeah. And so they were pretty well equipped to be in this environment, but many people had come in from the western part of Poland, so from real, urban environments. They, weren't accustomed to being in the forest, and let alone such a dense, difficult forest. But for 2 years they did this, and so that means that they went through 2 winters, really brutal winters. I know you guys get cold here, so it's similar temperatures.
So we have insulated boots.
Yes, you do. So negative 40 degrees were the record-setting temperatures during the winter of 1941, and similarly in 42. There were lice infestations that led to typhus outbreaks. There were frostbite exposure. People starved. People succumbed to hypothermia. There were doctors in the woods. Most of them had been sort of conscripted to treat just the Soviet partisan fighters. It was very difficult for them to break away and go out to these family camps that had, set up all over the different parts of the woods. They did manage to come, but they didn't have medicine. So they used kitchen knives for surgeries. They used vodka for, sterilizing tools and for anesthesia. So it was pretty grim. But one of the other things about this family, and this photo here on the left is after the war, right when they arrived as refugees in Italy.
I was just going to ask you about the Italian period.
Yes. So this family survived all together. And that was really a remarkable thing that happened, because oftentimes the people who had already been, under Soviet occupation and under Nazi occupation for the better part of, 3.5 years, not many families were still together at this point. If they were surviving selections, if they had managed to flee liquidations, people were coming in, kids were coming in as orphans, wives were coming in maybe with children, not with husbands. And this man here on the very left, his name was Ben Sakir, and he ended up marrying Luba, Miriam Rabinowitz's sister, but he came into the woods having had a wife and children, and they had all died. And he met the family in the forest. So it was a lot. It was a lot to go through for them, but they managed to survive remarkably. And one thing Morris Rabinowitz used to say was that if he knew what was waiting for them in the woods, he would never have gone in. But he was actually responsible, given his position, given his knowledge of the forest. Even though it was sort of reluctantly, he ended up being kind of the leader of their family group, which intentionally stayed away from partisan activity because they thought it was safer. And there were something like 30 people with them. The numbers changed as the months went on, but they managed to stay together.
There's sort of a phenomenon that you talk about a little bit of how people that survived the forest, they don't like to refer to themselves as survivors in the same way.
It's interesting because this was something I kind of gradually understood. I didn't understand this distinction, right? They survived the woods, and the Holocaust and the Nazis, so they were survivors. Let's see here. This is a photo. This was the first on the left here. This is Miriam's in the front, and that's Rachel or Ruth, and Tanya or Toby, and that's Ruth and Toby on the right after Italy. And this photo on the left is the very first photo that was taken of them after they came out of the woods in 1944. And you can see how diminished they are. And then even less than a year later, there they are on the right, and they're sort of full and fresh-faced and happy. But to your question, they were survivors. And I think that what Toby said to me when we finally started talking about this was that, well, yes, what we went through was very terrible and it was awful, but we weren't in the camps. And so I think it took both Ruth and Toby a while, and this was years, of course, before I knew them and before I, was even thinking about writing this book, that I think it took them a good long time to sort of accept that identity, because it was terrible, but it wasn't as bad.
As terrible.
It wasn't as terrible. And something I also just learned since the book has come out, I've gotten to know the family a little bit better. So one of Ruth's granddaughters, Elizabeth, and I have become friendly, and she's a book editor and really wonderful. And we were talking, and she was telling me about her experience knowing this story growing up, because I think Ruth and Rabbi, even though they talked about their experiences, things really came out with the grandkids. That was when they were really talking about things. And she said she told the story to one of her teachers, that her grandparents survived the Holocaust in the woods. And the teacher said, no, that's not right. That's not part of this history. And so, the forest history isn't as well known. And I think, it is of course part of this history. It is important. It's important that we know it. even if it doesn't represent, a large number of people.
It's also important because each day, practically, the numbers of survivors dwindles.
It does. And so this is an interesting point when we consider this history, because as I've written before and as we've talked about in our conversations, that, it's going to be a very different thing to not have that connection to living memory and people who can't say, I experienced this, I survived this. It's really going to change how we engage this history and how we share it and disseminate it and how we keep it from being lost. So I feel extremely grateful that I was able to start the book when I started it, and that I was able to have the time that I had with the family. And another survivor in particular, whose name is Ted Weinstone. And in the book, he's the boy with the frozen feet who comes to their family camp in the woods. His name, so Ted Weinstone, and he's from Memphis, Tennessee. And I went to see him like 2 weeks before the pandemic hit. And I got to interview him, and his interview was incredibly important because, as we all do, a lot of these memories are very emotional, and particularly when you're dealing with the memory of people who were children at the time they experienced it, it's not attached to a chronological timeline. It's attached to events that impacted them in an emotional way. Right. But Ted is an incredible person for numbers and dates. So he knows exactly what day he came to find the Rabinowitz family camp, and he knows exactly how many months they were and exactly how many paces their first, they called them Zimlanka, which are these little bunkers under the earth in the woods, how many paces it was from this Zimlanka to that Zimlanka. And so it was essential for my understanding of where they were in the woods and how long they were in each place, because people weren't keeping records, and unlike, as terrible as they are, the Nazi records and memos they kept of all their prisoners, it's documentation. It means we know which people were in which place at which time, and where, when they were moved, what happened to them. In the forest, it's not the same kind of, there is no documentation, or if there is, it is very hard to come by, and it's not necessarily an accurate depiction because it might be Soviet partisan records, and there's a whole thing about how they kept quiet, the narrative of Jewish fighters, and so.
I haven't asked you this question, but in hearing about this whole phenomenon of the woods and the forest, since you wrote this, have you heard from other families that have had similar experiences?
I have. I wrote a piece for the New York Times right before the book came out, and I was just telling someone else who's here tonight who has a connection to Jadal through their family. I have heard from people who I actually wrote about but wasn't able to find them because what I was doing was watching Shoah Foundation testimony from the 90s. So names had changed or people had since passed, and so I couldn't find their relatives. And that's been incredible because I watch these testimonies over and over again in a way that I feel like I know these people even though we've never met in real time. And then to hear from their grandchildren or their, children is very special to me. And just recently I went to New York and I interviewed a woman. The family reached out to me and asked me if I would want to come and hear her story. Her name is Faye. And she's 96 years old. She's an incredible lady. And she has a forest story unlike anything I've ever heard before. She was essentially adopted by a very small Christian village. They're Catholic. And she was blonde and blue eyes, so she could pass. And they kept her hidden. And so she was in the woods, but not in the same way. She was never really in a camp. They didn't really have the same sort of structure to it. And some of them kept her safe, I think, because in exposing that she was there at all, they would all have been killed. But this one family in particular kind of adopted her and took care of her, and it put so many lives at risk. I mean, it's amazing. And so,
does she have continued contact with that family?
She's never been able to find them. For years, she and her husband own a grocery store in New York City. And there were a lot of Polish people who would come in, and she had written out on a piece of paper the name of the woman who had been her friend and her contact information to see if she could try and find her. And she,
Never
to my
happened.
knowledge, no, it never did. So she says maybe she got married, you know,
Right.
her name changed, it's not the same anymore. But she did try. Yeah.
If there's a hero or heroine of this story, who do you think it is?
Wow, there are many, and we haven't gotten to talk about, you know, everyone in this family. Their aunt Luba risked her life at one particular interval to, you know, help keep the family safe. But for me, I always come back to Miriam, in part because she's sort of at least at one stage, she's the reason why Philip was asked, there is a story at all. And she's the reason why generations of her own family continue on in the way they've continued on, because she saved the boy who would become her son-in-law. But I also think about her because I do think, would I have been able to do what Miriam did? And I won't ever know unless I'm in, and none of us really will. I don't think you can. I don't think Miriam would have known. And
No.
Toby and I have talked about this, and so have Ruth and I, but I like to think that she's the example, right? If there's an example to follow, it's that moment, it's her instinct, it's her reaction, whether it was, you know, she was a mother and she just wanted to help, or whatever it was, that it's the one to sort of pass on. And of course, as I said, there are other mothers who did things to save their children, and those mothers are in this book too. But she's the one. Yeah, it's Miriam.
It's a really amazing phenomenon, to the Rabbi and Ruth phenomenon, to be able to survive what they survived, and then give, well, first of all, to create their own family, but then to oversee the creation of so many families in their community and to pass on that message. It's something that was in us because we had the experiences of interacting with them and hearing it. And it's again, it's a story that matters. It's a story that really matters.
Yeah. And their sons, Barry, Alan, and David, and of course other people in the family too will say this, but it really is, it's like in the backbone of all of them, you know, because they both, on both sides, their grandparents were survivors and their parents were survivors. So, you know, this example, if you do good, if you put good into the world, it's not because you want good to come back to you, but it will. It's the right way to live. And so I know they all have internalized it in their personal lives and their professional lives. It does. It's like a glow in some ways that just sort of gets cast around them. So it's special people. Yeah.
Now I'm going to slightly embarrass you. I didn't
Oh boy.
tell you that I was going to do this, but I find it a remarkable story how you talk about how you yourself are drawn to stories and telling stories that matter. You have someone significant in your life who is in the process of telling a story that matters deeply to him too.
Yes.
Because this is really, I know, I'm sorry,
No,
but,
it's okay.
but it's moving to me.
Yeah.
Can you share it just a little bit without completely
Sure.
embarrassing?
I don't know. My partner is in Ukraine right now. He's a photojournalist. He's back again. He was there for about 3 months, from January to mid-March. So he was there when the war started. And
You told me he lived there before.
He did. He lived there around 2014 and 2015. So he was there covering the first war, the first conflict outbreak. So for him, it's a place that holds a lot of importance. He really loves the culture and he loves the people and friends that he has there. So, you know, when there was talk that war was going to come again and that Russia would possibly invade, even though, of course, everyone said that was not going to happen.
Big secret.
He wanted to be there for many reasons, and so he went. And up until, you know, the shells started coming, we didn't think, you know, that it would happen. But yeah, I'm very proud of him.
He's there telling a story that matters to him too.
He is, yes, he is, and he's doing a very good job of it. So, yeah, yes.
The whole experience of this for me has been very beautiful because again, these are people that I knew in my childhood, but never to this degree of depth. And I think that it's such a beautiful gift that you've given to so many of us that grew up with these people as models in our community in West Hartford, to be able to understand what it is that is at their core and has driven them to lead this life in service of the Jewish community. So that's a beautiful thing.
It is. And it's funny because when you know you're a kid and you grow up, I used to think everybody kept kosher because we kept kosher at home. And so it was a very big shock to me. You don't have dairy plates and you don't have meat plates. But I also sometimes feel surprised when I visit a community like ours and there isn't a Ruth or a rabbi. And I hope that I never took it for granted. But I do understand now what an important thing that was. And of course, now there's Toby who's in my circle now, and we have a wonderful friendship. And now, even though I never met them, I know Morris and Miriam, and that's an amazing thing too. So.
And the world does. So thank
Yes.
you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for being
It's wonderful
here.
to have had you here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of you who joined us this evening. And it's great to see people back together in person. I think that as we all develop, let's say, cultural immunity to going back into these in-person gatherings and feeling comfortable doing so, I hope that the numbers will continue to grow as we go along. And to those of you who joined us virtually, it's been great to have you with us as well. Please do not forget to join us next Tuesday as my colleague and friend Rabbi Rachel Cole-Feingold interviews Shan Julie Wang on her book, Beautiful Country, a memoir. That's next Tuesday at 8:30 p.m. And again, it will be both in person and online. Sorry, 7:30 p.m. It is 8:30 p.m. Yes, 7:30 p.m. And it'll be both in person and online. And I encourage you to get yourself a copy of Into the Forest. For those of you not here with us, buy it wherever you buy your books. And continue to join us in all of our online programming at Shaar Hashomayim. Have a wonderful evening.